Hello and welcome to Conversations, and we're bringing you one of those great Australian stories that centres around a moment that took place nearly 70 years ago, a long way away. If you look at a map of Indonesia, you can see there's a thin stretch of water between the two main islands of Java and Sumatra, and this little stretch of water is called the Strait of Sunda. In March 1942, a ship was sunk there. The ship was HMAS Perth, a warship that had already seen plenty of action in the Mediterranean. This time, though, she'd been fighting a desperate battle against a Japanese fleet. She fired until her ammunition ran out, and then she sank, taking 353 members of her crew, including the captain, a man who many regard as one of our finest fighting sailors. The survivors, who were pulled out of the water or who managed to swim ashore, were taken into Japanese custody, and they were worked as slave labour on the Burma-Siam Railway, where their lives became a perfect hell. But here's the thing. The lives of the crew on their first few months at sea aboard HMAS Perth was like heaven. They went to Jamaica and Tahiti and New York. There were dancing girls and music and baseball and even Hollywood movie stars. They were such young men, and they saw the very best and worst of what life had to offer. Well, Mike Carlton's long been fascinated by the men of HMAS Perth. Mike, as you probably know, is one of our best-known broadcasters and journalists, and he's told the story of this legendary warship and its crew in a book that's called Cruiser, The Life and Loss of HMAS Perth and Her Crew. Mike was a guest at this year's Brisbane Writers' Festival, and I spoke to him in front of a live audience at the State Library of Queensland. And I should tell you before we start that sitting right at the front was one of the men of HMAS Perth, who was now well into his 80s, who came along with his wife, and who was listening to the whole thing very closely.
Thank you very much.
Mike, there's heaven and hell in this story, and sadly more hell than heaven. It's a great, great Australian story. How did you find it?
I came across it when I was very, very young. I was about 11 or 12, and I was rummaging through a bookcase at home one day and came across a book called Behind Bamboo, written by a fellow called Rowan Rivett, who was a young Adelaide journalist. He'd been captured at the fall of Singapore, ended up as a POW, and had told, very briefly in passing, really, the story of Perth. How she was sunk by the Japanese, how most of her crew ended up on the Burma-Siam Railway, many of them in Japan itself. And that book was written shortly after the war. And it lodged with me. It fascinated me for reasons I can't explain. And it awoke in me a real love of naval history. And then I did all that sort of, teenage thing of wanting to join the Navy, run away to sea and captain a destroyer, that sort of stuff. And I never did. I got stuck into journalism instead, much to my great regret, because I'd like to have been in the Navy. But I developed this love of naval history throughout my life. And so I went down to the sea in books rather than in ships, if you know what I mean, culminating with the greatest historical writer of them all, Patrick O'Brien. And I'd always told myself that one day I wanted to write a naval history, or a novel at one stage. And then towards the, as I got older and older and older, I thought, well, the hell, time is running out, I'll do it. And quite by chance, I happened to meet one of the Perth survivors in Sydney and started talking to him, and bang, it was on. And it became literally, I know it says on the blurb of the book, this is the book I had to write, but it's true. I felt it was in there and it had to get out.
It's a very big subject. You'd want to tell the truth. You want to honour the men who died and the men who are still alive, all those things, and try and tell this very, very big story of all these men and bring it together and make it work. Were you daunted, Mike?
Not daunted. I looked forward and eagerly to it and grabbed it with both hands. As soon as I started the research, it was almost exhilarating to at last be digging into this story that had been with me for so long. And then when I met more of the ship's company, some who'd survived imprisonment, some who'd left the ship before that, they were such fascinating men with such a story to tell, and they had a real beauty to them in that in advancing age, they didn't have to bullshit anymore, if you'll pardon me. They wanted the truth to be told, and once they felt they could trust me, they were willing to tell it. For the sake of their children and their grandchildren and for the sake of history itself. Not all of them. Some found the memories too painful, and a couple just simply didn't want to talk. And I respected that, of course you do. But the blokes who did talk were the most amazing men.
Australia back then was a very, very different place where population was around 7 million, I think. Very different.
Not quite that, yeah.
Not even quite that.
Yeah.
Our Navy was quite young. How did HMAS Perth come to our position? Where does one go and buy a warship?
During the Depression, the Navy ran down. They had 3 ships. But as the war clouds started to gather around Europe and the rise of Italian fascism and German Nazism, the Australian government thought we better do something about this. They didn't do a lot, but they did buy 3 ships from the British: Perth, Sydney and Hobart. Sydney's quite well known. Everyone knows the story of how Sydney was lost in the Indian Ocean to that German raider, the Cormoran. Perth was a sister ship. She was the last to be bought. And they'd been flogging around the Royal Navy for a couple of years. But they were good ships. They were beautiful ships, just to look at. A sailor's eye, and any sailor will tell you how beautiful and elegant they were. They had classic, graceful lines. And they were, by the standards of the day, pretty much state-of-the-art. They weren't some rubbish that we just picked up cheap. They were well-found, sea-kindly ships, as sailors call them. They were well-armed. They were incredibly powerful. They could, I don't want to give you too much detail, they could knock off a speed of 32.5 knots, which is about 65 kilometres an hour. And that's a respectable speed for a warship even today. So they were fast, they packed a punch, they were elegant and powerful.
Were they designed to sort of go in, pack a huge punch and then get out again, or were they there to stay and fight?
Cruisers are a weird species. There aren't too many of them left. The Americans have got them bristling with missiles now, and the Russians have got a couple. Nobody else sort of keeps them anymore. They've been superseded a bit by submarines. They were basically designed for sinking enemy merchant shipping, to prowl the seas on their own and sink enemy cargo liners and so on and so on. They could also work with a fleet as as advanced scouts and that sort of thing. And this is what Perth was doing. They had a big crew. I mean, there were 681 men on board when on Perth's final voyage.
As big as a floating country town, in other words.
Yeah, well, if you've got a rough picture in your mind of what our warships look like today, the frigates today, probably almost 3 times the size. But they were the absolute pride of the pre-war Navy.
She had an onboard computer of sorts too, didn't she, Mike? How did that work?
Yeah.
Well, a calculating machine of kinds.
Pretty primitive. There are 2 actually, to aim and direct and fire the guns, called the Admiralty Fire Control Table. And it was a primitive analogue computer. It didn't work all that well. It was okay for the big guns, which were basically firing at other ships or onshore bombardment. But what they call the high-angle control table was largely useless. That was for shooting at oncoming, incoming aircraft. It simply wasn't up to the job.
How did we collect her? How was she collected from the British?
It's an extraordinary story. They put together a crew of about some 600 guys. And you've got to think of pre-war Australia then. Overseas foreign travel was almost unknown. It was a privilege for only the stinking rich who could afford the P&O across back home to the mother country. But these guys got to do it. And most of them were teenagers or in their very early 20s. The thing that always strikes me when I look at the photos of how young they were, These are kids who'd grown up with the Depression. They knew what it was like to go hungry at the age of about 10, or they knew what it was like to have, mum pawn the wedding ring so they could buy a rabbit for Sunday dinner, that sort of thing. And yet here they were sent to the other side of the world. They packed most of them on board a rotten old boat called the Autolycus, which had previously been carrying horses around the South Pacific. It was pretty rough, and some of these kids, although they wore the Navy uniform, had literally never been to sea before. So they set off on this grand adventure. They did the whole ceremony of crossing the line and all that sort of stuff, and fetched up in the English summer, the height of the English summer, June, July 39, to pick up this ship. And away they went. And it was for them the adventure of a lifetime. They thought it was fabulous. Their next stop off was to be the 1939 New York World's Fair. And this, again, was a stunning sight for these kids. New York, skyscrapers, movie stars, Coca-Cola, which they'd never seen before. Coca-Cola had not arrived in Australia in 1939. So they began, I guess you could call this magical mystery tour, this astonishing stay in Manhattan.
Tell me what happened when they arrived in Manhattan, because they became famous in New York, didn't they?
Kind of bad, that one. A lot of them were very new in the Navy, and they weren't all that crazy about naval discipline, They'll knock about kids